The tragic case of George Stinney Jr. In the spring of 1944, in a small southern town divided by race and poverty, a crime occurred that would forever stain the history of American justice. It was the murder of two young white girls, Betty June Binnicker, age 11, and Mary Emma Thames, age 8, in Alcolu, South Carolina. But the tragedy did not end with their deaths. What followed was the arrest, trial, and execution of the youngest person in modern U.S. history to face the electric chair, 14-year-old George Junius Stinney Jr. This is the story of how a child was swept into the machinery of a justice system built on racial prejudice, how his life was taken before it had barely begun, and how it took 70 years for his name to be cleared. Alcolu was a typical mill town of the Deep South in the 1940s. It was a community of fewer than 500 people, surrounded by farmland and pine forests. The town itself was neatly and deliberately divided. White families lived on one side of the railroad tracks, black families on the other. The sawmill was the main employer, and it provided work to both communities, but segregation defined every part of daily life. Signs marked water fountains, schools, and businesses. The line of separation was not just physical, it was enforced through social custom and backed by law. In this world of rigid racial boundaries, even innocent interactions between children could carry dangerous consequences. On March 23, 1944, Betty June Binnicker and Mary Emma Thames spent the afternoon riding their bicycles through Alcolu. Betty June, older and more outgoing, was fond of asking neighbors about wildflowers. That day the girls were seen pedaling along dirt roads, their laughter echoing through the warm spring air. At one point, they approached the Stinney household, where George Jr. and his little sister Amy were standing outside. The girls asked if they knew where to find a certain type of flower. It was a short, ordinary conversation, just children talking. The girls then continued on their way, but they never returned home. As the sun began to set, worry spread among their families. By nightfall, search parties had formed, carrying lanterns into the woods and fields. Dozens of neighbors combed the area, calling out the girls' names. Hours later, their bodies were discovered in a shallow ditch, their bicycles discarded nearby. Both girls had been brutally beaten with a heavy object. The brutality of the crime shocked the community. Yet in the racially divided South, fear and grief quickly turned to suspicion. And suspicion needed a target. George Stinney Jr. lived with his family in a modest home on the black side of Alcolu. His father worked at the sawmill, his mother took care of their children, and George himself was known as a quiet, skinny boy who enjoyed drawing and playing marbles. At just over 5 feet tall and weighing barely 90 pounds, George hardly looked like someone capable of violence. But the fact that he had spoken to Betty June and Mary Emma that day marked him in the eyes of law enforcement. The morning after the bodies were found, deputies arrived at the Stinney home. They ordered George into the back of the sheriff's car. His parents were not allowed to accompany him. In that moment, the family's world shattered. George was taken to a small room for questioning. No lawyer was present. No parent was there to protect him. The questioning of a frightened 14-year-old boy took place behind closed doors, without recorders or witnesses. Later, police claimed George confessed to the murders, even adding that he wanted to have relations with one of the girls. But there was no signed statement, no written confession, nothing but the word of the sheriff and deputies. George's family was immediately put in danger. His father was fired from his job. Threats from white residents forced the Stinneys to flee their home. Meanwhile, George was kept in custody far from Alcolu, as authorities feared a lynch mob might storm the jail. The state wasted no time. Within a month of his arrest, George was indicted and brought to trial. The courthouse in Sumter, South Carolina, was filled with white townspeople eager to see the boy convicted. George's court-appointed attorney was a tax lawyer with no experience in criminal defense. He called no witnesses. He did not challenge the confession or present an alibi, though George's siblings insisted he had been with them at home during the time of the murders. The prosecution, meanwhile, painted George as a predator. They offered no physical evidence linking him to the crime, no bloodstains, no weapon, no witnesses. Their case rested entirely on the alleged confession and the fact that George had spoken with the girls earlier in the day. The trial lasted less than 3 hours. The jury, all white men, deliberated for just 10 minutes. They returned with a single word: guilty. The judge wasted no time. He sentenced George Stinney Jr. to death by electrocution. At just 14 years old, George became the youngest person in modern U.S. history to receive such a sentence. In the weeks that followed, George sat in a cell far from his family. His parents were not allowed to visit him before his execution. His siblings later recalled the helplessness they felt, knowing their brother was alone, terrified, and unable to understand what was happening to him. George's former cellmate would later remember the boy's words. "I didn't do it," George said. "Why would they kill me for something I didn't do?" Yet appeals for clemency fell on deaf ears. South Carolina officials refused to intervene. For the white citizens of Alcolu, justice had been served. For the black community, it was a chilling reminder of the system's cruelty. On June 16, 1944, George Stinney Jr. was led into the death chamber at the Central Correctional Institution in Columbia. He was so small that he did not fit the electric chair properly. Guards placed a stack of books beneath him so the electrodes could reach his body. The oversized mask meant to cover his face slipped off, revealing his tear-streaked cheeks as the current surged through him. In moments, his young life was ended. George Stinney Jr. was only 14 years old. For decades, George's case haunted civil rights advocates, historians, and his surviving family members. His brothers and sisters, who had fled Alcolu after his arrest, grew older but never stopped speaking of George's innocence. They recalled how he had been home at the time of the murders, helping tend to the family's cow, and how none of that testimony had ever reached the courtroom. In the years after the civil rights movement, George's story became a symbol of the dangers of racial injustice in America and its legal system. Books, articles, and documentaries retold the tragic case of the boy who was too young for the chair, yet sent to it anyway. In 2013, attorneys filed a motion to reopen the case, arguing that George had been denied his constitutional rights. They pointed out the complete lack of evidence, the unreliable confession, and the incompetent defense. They also presented the alibi testimony from George's surviving siblings. A year later, in December 2014, a South Carolina Circuit Court judge vacated George's conviction. The judge ruled that George had not received a fair trial and that his Sixth Amendment rights had been violated. After 70 years, the state acknowledged what his family had known all along. George Stinney Jr. had been wrongfully convicted. The exoneration brought some measure of relief to George's surviving family. Yet no ruling could return the life of the boy who had been executed at just 14. His case remains one of the most infamous examples of racial injustice in American history, a reminder of how prejudice can corrupt the courts, and how fragile justice can be when it depends on fear and suspicion rather than truth. Today, George's story is taught as both a cautionary tale and a call to vigilance. It is a story about a child who never had the chance to grow up, whose voice was silenced by a system that saw only his skin color. George Junius Stinney Jr. should have lived a long life. He should have had the chance to play marbles with his siblings, to walk the railroad tracks as a young man, to dream of a future. Instead, he was condemned, executed, and forgotten by the courts of his time. 70 years later, history finally cleared his name, but justice delayed is still justice denied.